hardly middle-aged. Middle-aged is more like 50, 55.
Only if you live to be 110.
Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for square pegs in round holes. And also for round pegs in square sockets. But no triangles, that's for sure. Not while I'm alive, anyway. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, a closet triangle. And today we're going to tackle a big question, a big societal question. What's actually happening with the midlife crisis? And in answer to your immediate follow-up question, no, not yet, thank you, how are you? Now granted, this is a topic that's a little different than our usual fodder here on the orphanage, but oddly enough, we're going to enter it by way of economics, because it turns out that, as unlikely as it seems, not only are midlife crises deeply misunderstood, it was economists who stumbled onto what's actually happening. And their insights, coupled with some fascinating social psychology and even some tests involving chimps, have blown apart these stereotypes of fast cars, absurd pot-bellied men, and their lamentable affairs with the office secretary. Because it turns out, so-called midlife crises are actually something very different than the quippy stereotype we see in sitcoms. And fortunately, the underlying mechanics of the situation are both fascinating and deeply beneficial to society at large. There's something bigger and better happening than just entropy and hair plugs. And when we start to grasp what's actually occurring, it raises some really interesting labor and policy implications. I'm going to give you a taste. My guest thinks that, in light of what we now know about midlife transitions, people ought to be able to dip into their Social Security early, before they retire, just for a year, as a kind of gap year available to them to try out new things when that midlife restlessness sets in, which I think is a brilliant idea, and you'll find out why today as we get into the science, neurology, and economics of the midlife crisis, right here on The Political Orphanage.
If only I had the voice of Mighty Heaton.
Thank you, Eric. Keep that bit. The very kind voice that you just heard is that of Jonathan Rauch. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and the author of the excellent book, The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After Age 50, which you can find wherever books are sold, or make it easier on yourself. Go to mightyheaton.com/featured, where you'll see all the other books we discuss on the show. John, I am so pleased to be talking to you again. We're basically roommates now.
I am happy to be back with you and Wallace.
Yeah.
The Wonder Dog.
Yeah, we spoke from, I don't know when the episode will drop, but we spoke about 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, about the lavender scare, which was a very well-received episode and a very good discussion. And as we were hanging out afterwards, I don't quite know what was, no, we were having lunch.
I warned you.
Yeah. And
I warned you. You're about 40,
right,
I think.
You were like, you're a walking midlife crisis. It's going to, any minute, it's going to hit you like a piano in a cartoon. I got to save your life, Heaton.
It might just, yes. I said, if there's one thing of mine that you need to read, it's the manual for your 40s. And it's a book called The Happiness Curve. And it's kind of autobiographical because I got hit by all of this stuff. And then when I tried to figure it out, I wound up writing a book about it. Pretty much the Heaton MO.
Thank you.
If you get curious, you write a book or do a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is exactly that. It is a manual for your 40s. Like a lot of this is just selfishly me hoping to avoid ridiculous midlife crises, etc., by relying on your wisdom. But as I read your book, I thought less and less of the application to me and more of my friends who are my age or a little bit older. There's one friend I can think of here in Austin that's in their mid-40s that is struggling right now. And as I was reading your book, everything started to click. And I was like, oh, it's not that I have all these friends individually happening to go through a difficult transition period. They're all at the same time in their life going through these transitions. So
that's exactly right. And something I often say is your mileage will vary. What we're about to talk about doesn't happen to everyone. Of course, lots of variables go into your satisfaction with your life. But I can promise you that if you're in your late 30s or 40s or even early 50s and sometimes beyond, someone in your life is having these problems and probably too embarrassed to talk about it. And just befriending that person, understanding what they're going through in yourself and others gets you a long way toward resolving it.
Well, so let's kick it off with this then. What is the stereotype or cartoon of the midlife crisis in our culture, and how does that vary from the actual facts that you have at your disposal?
So the stereotype is stereotypically male, although what actually happens is not gendered at all. It's identical for men and women. And it's that men get restless and bored and behave childishly and irresponsibly and throw away their lives and marriage in order to buy a red convertible sports car, invariably red in the stereotype, run off with age-inappropriate women, or if they're gay, men, and live in a place wearing clothing that is somewhat embarrassing to them. That's the stereotype, that this is a self-indulgent and irresponsible and childish thing that men go through, and that it's fine to laugh at. None of those things is true.
When we're talking about it, then what is the reality of what's happening? I mean, first of all, is this an emergent thing that is biologically native to us, or is this a confluence of external factors, i.e., I am slowing down, my parents are slowing down, we meet in the middle? Where's this?
Well, you just asked the entire book. So shall we disaggregate a couple of those things?
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's talk first for a minute or two about the what before we talk about the why, because the what is pretty straightforward. The why gets interestingly complicated.
Well, then I'll make an easier bite-sized question for you. What is the difference between depression and dissatisfaction? Because I feel those are relevant to what we're discussing.
So, yes, it is. Depression is about your mood. It's about what psychologists call your affect. It's about feeling low and miserable. You'll often have trouble getting out of bed and functioning, low self-esteem, those kinds of things. That is different from discontent, which is related to life satisfaction. So this gets in the weeds a little, but it's helpful to sort these things out. People who talk about this talk about two ways to think about happiness. One is affective happiness. And that's, what's your mood right now? Are you feeling up or down? Are you feeling depressed, elated? You measure that with questions like, how many times did you smile today? Did you feel worried yesterday? That kind of thing. There's a whole separate category called evaluative happiness. And it's different and turns out to be more important for our overall well-being. Evaluative happiness is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfying and rich do you think your life is right now? Or another way to ask it is, how close is your life to the ideal life that you could imagine for yourself? So what you're doing with this question isn't, am I depressed right this minute? It's, am I satisfied with my life as a whole? And it's on that dimension, life satisfaction, that the happiness curve strikes. That's what happened to me. I started noticing it around the time I turned 40, a year or two before. I didn't understand what was going on because on all the variables in life, all the things that we measure, stuff like I had a good, solid relationship. Really, for the first time in my life, I was going gangbusters in my career. I was financially solid. I mean, things were going great, and yet I was feeling gradually more and more like I wasn't doing anything worthwhile in my life. And I would literally wake up with these little voices in my head. They're almost like demons saying, you're wasting your time. You need to quit your job. You need to do something different. I knew this was really irrational when I turned I turned 45, not 25, and win, to my own amazement, the biggest prize in magazine journalism, the equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, which I never expected to happen to me. Well, the good news is that got rid of the life dissatisfaction demons. The bad news is only for about 10 days. And then they just came roaring back. And by that time, I knew what was going on was not rational. But it didn't feel like depression. This is a contentment disorder. Then subsequently, a few years later, from a colleague at the Brookings Institution where I work, I learned about this thing called the U-shaped life satisfaction curve. And I learned that it's, on statistical average, it bottoms out in the mid to late 40s.
Which I'm very glad, by the way, you caught me when you did, because I turned 40 maybe a month before we physically met. And I'm reading your book going, oh, I'm at the top of the ski jump. Like I'm looking down this wild ride. I'm really glad I read your book at the beginning of this process, so I could see what's coming next on the bend. And
what happens to people is what's happening here, when we get to the why, we'll talk about it, is a perfectly normal, natural, and if properly managed, healthy transition. And it leads to something great. There's a reason we're going through this. But it feels pretty strange when you're going through it, and pretty down. And if you don't understand what's going on, you think, oh my God, there's something wrong with me. I'm ungrateful. I'm wretched. So that complicates it, because now you feel bad about feeling bad. And you also feel embarrassed, because if you're successful like me, you feel like I have not earned this unhappiness. I mean, there are people in miserable shape all over. I have no excuse for this. So then you get ashamed, and that makes it worse. And then you don't tell people, and that makes it even worse. So you're suffering in silence. I didn't even tell my husband, Michael.
Right.
And that's why it's so important to forearm yourself with understanding what's happening, and that there's nothing wrong with you or with your friends if they're going through it.
A couple of clarification questions, because one of the things that I love about your book is it is a manual. There's a great source of wisdom there, and I feel like I learned a lot about how to cope with this. But one of the things I really love about the book is that it has a scientific basis to it. So it's not just a collection of aphorisms of, that which you cannot cure, you must endure, lean into the stoicism. There actually is a scientific basis for it. So
yes, it's all very statistical. Mm-hmm. It's very measured. It's very real.
Well, so two clarifications on that. When we talk about effective mood and subjective well-being or evaluative well-being, is that kind of like weather versus climate? Like,
yes.
Is it okay? So
that's a nice analogy.
Austin has lovely weather, horrible climate. But that's like, but if I go outside and I'm like, it's sunny, why are you mad?
They're a bit more different than weather and climate, because it's perfectly possible to be in a terrible mood or just feel low and bad one day, while at the same time feeling, I'm doing some really important work with my life right now.
Yeah. You could
maybe you're in Mississippi with the Freedom Riders and you're getting the crap beaten out of you and you're scared, witless. Nonetheless, you probably feel like I'm here for a reason.
Or like your car blows a tire on the highway and it ruins your day. You're in a foul mood, but at the back of your mind, you know that this is a temporary thing. Overall, life is good. You're feeling good.
That's right. And it turns out people have no trouble distinguishing these two. It's very easy to get at these distinctions in polls and questionnaires.
Well, great. Then my next question is, how do you come up with this happiness U-shape? Because if I'm not a statistician. However, the more I learn about it, the more boggled my mind is. And if I were to ask you, 1 out of 10, how happy do you feel? And I ask Michael, and we ask me,
and Wallace, don't forget Wallace.
And Wallace, who's
snoozing on the floor next to us.
I think living a 9 out of 10 life, he thinks a 6 out of 10, because he would prefer that the house burned down and we live in the bushes. He's very jealous of homeless people and their dogs from his perspective. They get to live outside all the time.
Well, we could arrange that for you.
Yeah, we could make that happen. But say theoretically, I've got an incredible imagination, and so I can really imagine a hell of a 10, and somebody that is just a little bit more humble and pragmatic has a 10 that I would consider a 9. How do you end up being able to come up with these U-shaped curves if people have their own different scales they're using?
Well, you just ask them. It's not complicated. Gallup has been asking questions about life satisfaction for decades in, I think it's now almost 150 countries around the world. So there are millions and millions of data points. And it turns out that when you check people's self-evaluations against other indicators like suicide rates, depression rates, medications, and so forth, the things you can measure, it turns out they're pretty solid. People give you a pretty good and pretty consistent read. So the data are quite solid. Where it comes from is, so maybe, Andrew, there's this really interesting thing going on here that's kind of hard to understand and important to explain. And maybe if it's okay with you, we can do that now.
Yeah.
So here's something that kind of blew my mind about this. One of several things that blew my mind. Where does this come from? There was a notion called midlife crisis. It was advanced in the mid-60s by a psychiatrist, Freudian psychoanalyst named Elliot Jakes. It took on in mass culture, but the psychological profession couldn't find it and dismissed it. And that seemed to be that. Then in the 90s, all this data that I've just been telling you about comes pouring in, and economists of all people, not psychologists, but economists start looking at it because they want to know, well, what's the value of GDP if gross domestic product, if getting richer doesn't make your life better? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So they go through all this data and they compile all these numbers on how happy and unhappy people are at different stages of their lives in different countries, and that's all fine. But then because they're statistics junkies, they say, well, we've got all this data. Let's start seeing which factors are important for happiness. And they run regression analysis so that they can pull out the effect of income, employment. Are you married? Do you have children? And so forth and so on. So then they correct for all those things to create a notional artificial person or group of people who are all the same on all those variables. They're not having marital problems. They're not unemployed and so forth. And that's when the weird thing happens, because they assumed that when the only thing left in the equation is age, just how old are you, that it would be flat, because all the things you care about that would affect your life have been subtracted out.
Yeah.
So what could be changing? But everywhere they looked, again and again, they saw the same pattern. When you adjust the data so that all you're looking at is the pure effect of aging, the aging process itself, they got the U shape. In other words, there's something about just going from the age of 25 to the age of 45, which on average, again, this may not apply to you, but on average is the equivalent of about half of unemployment or divorce.
Which is sizable.
And then it goes back up again. And this is wild. It just keeps going up well into your 80s and 90s.
So, because we've mentioned U-shape a couple of times, but we're doing an audio podcast, so I want to make sure we're able to flesh that out. Is it when we're using this subjective or evaluative well-being scale of 1 to 10, in your 20s, average American says like I'm an 8, and then it drops down to like a 5 at 45, and then it picks back up to a 7 at 50, and then it keeps going.
Up. Yeah, something like that. Except remember, this is a statistical person. It also happens to real people, so this also shows up in unadjusted data. But never mind. But that's basically right. If this curve starts at about age 20, because we're interested in adults, kids are different. And it extends through, the data get pretty dicey when you get into the 80s and 90s because people are dying off and being happier makes you live longer. But that's right. It's a gentle, gradual U-shaped curve that starts high at about age 20 and gradually declines, bottoming out in the mid to late 40s. The global average is about 47 years old. And then gradually begins to rise again. Now, the thing about it, it's not a crisis. At least for most people, it's not, because a crisis would be sudden, right? It would be a shock, like divorce or unemployment.
And
part of why those things feel so terrible.
Negative factor you would hope to avoid and could have avoided potentially. And
Yes, that's exactly right. Whereas this is going to happen gradually, and it's going to be in the background. So it's going to be cumulative. So now we get into the why. So we don't really know the reason why this happens because that's much harder to figure out. But there's some conjectures that I think are pretty solid about what's happening.
Well, and that's, by the way, I loved all the chapters on I think the third chapter, the second chapter is on the economics of this. And I loved that because like you're even calling out like, basically these Vulcan economists think everybody's irrational for being sad, but they have more stuff. And I'm like, I'm with the economists on this one, but I also recognize I'm an outlier. So I loved that. I thought it was fascinating. And getting into the statistical analysis, like you do start to see these theories arise. You make them come out. One of the things that blew my mind is that this is not just limited to Americans. It also includes chimps and orangutans. We're jumping over the human family to apes in general.
So that's what really got my attention is in 2012, I had been through this. I should say that I'm textbook. So in my case, these voices were saying these things about my life being a waste of time. I knew it was irrational. I started to worry about how irrational it was. I thought I would never feel grateful again. I didn't tell anyone about it. I made all the mistakes that you could make. And then at age 49, a lot of things did go kablooey. Both my parents got sick and then died in terrible disease in my father's case. And my job went away and stuff like that happened. Yet, I began to feel the fog of discontent lifting. And after 3 or 4 years, by the time I was 55 or so, I could tell that things had turned around, that I was on the upswing. So around the same time, when I'm 52 years old, this study comes out, finding the exact same pattern in life satisfaction, the analogy of life satisfaction in chimps and orangutans. And that's what got my attention.
Presumably, they were not filling out the questionnaire, but
they were not filling out the questionnaire.
Or Jane Goodall or somebody was doing it on their behalf. Who was familiar with them.
It turns out that primate handlers have to take very extensive inventories of well-being indicators, and they're objective ways to test how they're doing, because they'll act one way if they're feeling exalted and dominant, and another way if they're feeling gloomy and subordinate and that sort of thing. So that's when I thought, this needs to be a book. This is something fairly fundamental and fairly hardwired into primates. Mm-hmm. And that's what gets you into the interesting conjectures about what's going on.
Well, sure. I mean, already we've got what seems to me to be very, very good working components of an emergent theory, because I don't know any chimps that go buy a car, and I don't know any chimps worried about their job. I don't know any orangutans that are going, gosh, I really thought I was going to get that Cato Fellowship. It never came around. Like orangutans notoriously unconcerned with Cato Fellowships. So it would appear somebody to be emergent. Just to nail it down, I want to look at some of the confounding factors that could drill in on this. In America, the lifespan for a kid born today is like 77, 79, around that range. If we were to go to Honduras, lifespan, I don't know off the top of my head, but let's say it's like 65 or something. It's 10 to 15 years younger. Do they experience the U-shape earlier, or is it the same regardless of lifespan? Because that would indicate that it's a biological phenomenon rather than an external reaction.
So it's not only biological. Where you're living and what your culture is like also does have some influence. And last time I looked at it, I'm out of date on the data, but last time I looked at it, it varied. Okay. So the best place to be was Scandinavia. That's true in both absolute terms, which is how happy are people on a day-to-day level, how satisfied with life. And also it's true once you correct for all these other variables. They've got a high level of happiness, and their happiness curve bottoms out fairly early in life. If you think about it, that's good, because it means if you have a long life, you're going to spend more of it on the upswing, which feels way better than the downswing.
Yeah.
The worst place to be, last time I looked at it, again, I'm out of date, But I would expect this might well still be true. Would you like to guess where the worst place to be is? Because you probably can.
I'm going to guess Russia.
You would be correct.
Yeah, because I'm thinking low life expectancy plus just very limited optimism in general from what I've read.
All correct. So they have a low level of life satisfaction. They have a drop in life satisfaction like everywhere else. And then, in many cases, they die before the curve starts going upward.
Okay, yeah.
That's a real bummer.
Yeah.
That means you've spent your whole life on the downswing.
Right. Okay. Whereas normally the U curve most people see is
what we have in Western countries is more like a U shape, and we're living now into our 80s, and we're going to live longer.
Is that I don't know if you'd even be able to have the data on that. As the lifespan is increasing in America, is the nadir of the U shifting, or is it just that people that are older get to enjoy the upswing longer?
I don't know, and I do not know the answer to that. Remember, lifespan changes happen very gradually, so it would take some time to figure that out.
What about like you mentioned confounding factors that they're filtering out for, like health, marriage, depression, things like that. In looking at the graphs in your book, the nadir appears to be, from what I can tell, where most of my friends' children will be in middle school. That seems to be about that age. But then again, my friends are having kids later than my parents were, and we're all having kids later as a cohort than Honduras. So are children stressing people out and causing that slump, or are children not related to this?
Children are stressing people out. It turns out that children are good for your life satisfaction when they're grown up.
Okay.
When they're not grown up, they are a source of stress. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have children. But yes, midlife, of course, can be a time when you're responsible for your aging and infirm parents, and you're responsible for your little kids, and you're supposed to be at your peak earning years. So all of that can go on. But remember, this is the part that it's so hard to keep focused on. Even after you correct for the presence of children, you still see this dip, which means, in other words, that lots of people who either don't have children or who do have children and love having children will nonetheless feel this decline in life satisfaction just because they're getting older, which means, in other words, to put it very bluntly, midlife slump can be about nothing.
It's something innate rather than reactive.
In many cases, that is exactly correct. It's going on as a function of aging all by itself, yet we want to attribute it to something. And that's the mistake I was making. I was thinking, well, if I'm feeling this way, there must be something wrong with my life. And, I almost up and quit a really good professional situation. I was talked out of it. I'm really glad I was talked out of it because, of course, the U-curve would just have followed me to wherever I went because the problem wasn't my job. But we are not good at attributing the sources of our happiness and unhappiness. And when we're unaware that what's going on can just be part of the normal aging process, we can thrash around and think it must be my kids, it must be my marriage, I need a divorce, I need a new job. So then you can make mistakes which really do cause a midlife crisis.
This is really good to know.
It's really handy.
Really, really glad to know. Like, I think I'm in the same boat as most people where I struggle to identify the actual cause of my discontent on a regular basis, but I'm very good at outwardly logicking an impetus for it that's oftentimes wrong. So, like, one of the most intuitive and intelligent assessments I feel I've ever had in my life. My good friend Andrew Young and I were in Edinburgh. I go there every year, but he came over. We were going to work on a sitcom pilot together. We've been working on it all day. Fun activity, creative activity. I am just pissed off at him. I'm really irritated at my friend, and he keeps talking, and I'm like, God, I just want to smack him. And I start thinking about it, and I'm like, what is he doing to irritate me? And I go through my head, and I go, I don't think he's done anything irritating. But you know what's funny is this is just about when the majority of the jet lag would be hitting me at this exact moment. And then I kind of thought, I went, oh, I'm jet lagged as hell. That's it. And I went and grabbed him and was like, hey, man, I really don't like you right now, but I want you to know it's because of the jet lag. It's really, literally nothing you're doing. And I'm aware that you're perfectly fine. And yet I am thinking this. So I'm just going to go read a book for a minute.
Yeah, on a daily basis. Like just a week or two ago, I started feeling dizzy. And I'm starting, oh my God, I'm feeling dizzy. What's wrong? What's going on? And then I stop and I calm down and think, oh, wait, I had 3 cups of coffee.
Yeah.
Maybe it's caffeine.
When I was in my 20s, I would get really angry, and I'd try to figure out what in the world was making me angry, and then I'd eat a sandwich and I was fine. Or I'd drink too much coffee and I'd get paranoid. Okay, so this is good to know.
Yeah, we're not used to thinking of something as important as life satisfaction as having a will of its own.
Yeah.
But it does. And midlife, I say this again because it's so interesting and important, midlife malaise can be, and very often is, literally about nothing. It's like the Seinfeld show.
Okay, on that note then, since you seem to be gravitating towards an emergent thesis to explain the midlife malaise or transition rather than a confluence of external factors, am I right in thinking it is not then that we subconsciously go, oh, half of my life is over, my biggest accomplishments are over? That's us trying to understand why we're discontent?
No, actually, that's part of it. So my best guess, based on, the reading and talking I've done, is that 3 things are going on at once. And once again, if you're willing, it would be a little bit of a filibuster to go through these things. But the one that you mentioned is one of them. So it's not that this is a completely unconscious process. It's a mix.
Okay.
But, so the first thing that's going on is kind of weird. And it has to do with what economists call a forecasting error.
Okay.
We are programmed to be young and ambitious. Conquer the world, get that great job, get that house, get, the trophy partner, all of those things. And evolution says, get all that high status so you'll have lots of mating opportunities, and that will make you satisfied with life. So you're 23 years old and you think, when I get that job, that's going to do it for me. I'll be satisfied with my life. But ambition is a trickster. It keeps moving the goalpost because it wants you to keep moving.
Yeah.
So now you're 25, you've got that great first job, maybe you've got the boyfriend or girlfriend, that's going okay, but now you're feeling like, wait, there must be more to life, a little bit. But you're not worried about it because you're only 25.
And once I get that next promotion, then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But year after year, you're making the same mistake, which is you were over forecasting the amount of life satisfaction that you're going to get from that next increment of social accomplishment. It's as if you had moved to Seattle at age 22 for the sunshine. The first couple of years it's cloudy, but you think, okay, well, bad luck these first couple of years. By the time you're 40, you're starting to feel like, shit, I am living in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And it has built up on you. You really need that sunshine. So something like that has happened because all of the stuff you've accomplished has not had the satisfying effect that you expected. And that causes disappointment, which in turn causes unhappiness, which causes more disappointment. You get in a spiral, and that's where I was. And remember, it's not about anything. You can be doing great in life, and this syndrome will be worse because you're doing great in life.
Because you won't understand, why am I sad?
Exactly. You've accomplished all these
the car,
things.
I've
You've
got
got
the
them. I got the
multiple
National
wives.
Magazine Award.
Yeah.
Why the heck wasn't I satisfied with that? There must be something wrong with me. So that's problem one, this forecasting error, and it catches up with you. But then 2 other things happen.
Hold on, I'm going to pause you there. Then,
you're going to pause me. That's a good idea when I get going.
Well, I'm fascinated with this, and I like this is something I very much wanted to talk to you about. Okay, so first of all, to clarify with the forecasting error, are people 30-year-old me would be thrilled with where I am right now. 20-year-old me would be very disappointed with where I am right now.
So that's interesting.
So 20-year-old me thought absurd things were in my future, like just truly. And I think it's because you're you're in college and you're told by everyone that your generation is the Messiah and that, you are the future, et cetera, et cetera. Then 30, you get knocked around a while and you, in my case, climb back up and go, well, I'm doing great. So with the projection error, is it that you are wrong about what your accomplishments will be, or are you wrong about how much satisfaction you will derive from said accomplishments?
The latter.
Okay.
You're wrong about how satisfied you'll be with that next promotion. But what you said just now is consistent, because this leads to the second thing that's going on. You begin to correct for your mistake. Maybe by the time you're 30, or for most people later, it starts to dawn on you that next promotion is not the be-all and end-all that you ever thought it was going to be. And you start to realize you're on kind of a treadmill, and that can be kind of hard, but it does reset your expectations so that you begin to realize that there are other directions that you're going to need to have to look for that life satisfaction. And that leads to the second thing that's going on.
Hold on, I got one more question.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so part of the problem here is a mismatch. We are overly optimistic about the amount of satisfaction we will derive from our accomplishments.
Exactly, from our social accomplishments, from climbing the greasy pole and getting ahead in life.
I'm going to be in the state legislature, or I'm going to be vice president of the company, or whatever. We get there and go,
and by God, that will be, if I only do that in my life, I will have been
and for
happy.
2 weeks, great. And then we go, well, what's next?
And then it's in your pocket, the goalposts shift, and there you are all over again.
Does everybody have the same, more or less, gap between perceived satisfaction and actual satisfaction, or is it worse for optimists?
No, it's that I don't know, but nothing is true of everybody.
Okay.
Humans are wildly diverse.
It's not that optimists are wildly off and pessimists are happier in terms of this. That it's more individual than it is like optimists versus
pessimists. I actually don't know. My go-to on this is always to say your mileage may vary. Because there's a lot of other things going in your life in the meantime, a cancer diagnosis, a Nobel Prize. So all of those things are in the mix. One of the reasons can be so difficult to figure out what's going on in your life is it's never just one thing. And the factors in your life that are affecting it, things like your emotional set point, which is set mostly genetically, the conditions you live under, which you have some control of, but you can't make yourself rich if you're poor overnight, the choices that you're making, and your age are all figuring in, and they don't come labeled in nice boxes.
Right.
So you're sitting there scratching your head thinking what's going on, and it's never clear on the front end.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to something you asked a minute ago, because it's so cool and important. So you asked, so does being conscious of your age, how close you are to dying, does that affect it? And the answer is yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Interesting.
So a second thing, in addition to correcting the forecast error that we talked about, is that as you get older, your priorities, your values begin to change. You begin to think life is getting shorter, and you begin focusing more, on average, on things like the core relationships in your life. You begin to get more interested in pro-social cooperative kinds of achievement, like coaching the little league team or caring for a parent or grandparent. And you begin to get less interested in the next promotion and showing off your fancy new car. Some of that is just natural and happens automatically biologically, but some of it is also because we're conscious creatures, we're intelligent, we can look at our lives and kind of begin to say, well, maybe I don't want to focus on just having a job forever.
Yeah.
And we begin to reorient. And we know it's both because psychologists have done actual experiments where they tell people, okay, imagine your life were ending in 5 years, what would you do differently? And they will tell you, well, I'd focus less on my job and that next promotion and more on the people who are important. It turns out that focusing on those relationships in life, on giving back, on generosity, on caring, that's deeply satisfying, and those goalposts do not move.
Okay.
It's the opposite of ambition. Those things are like money in the bank. They actually build up And so as we make this transition through midlife away from status seeking and more toward our community, that's very helpful in making us happier. And then the third thing that's going on all at the same time, and this one's super easy to describe, our brains are changing.
Okay.
Older brains are less negative. They react more if you put them in an fMRI machine and show them faces that are sad and faces that are happy. Younger brains will react more to the unhappy faces. Older brains will react more to the happy faces. Older people are better at experiencing life with equanimity. They are less likely to be depressed. They have more perspective on life. They're not automatically wiser because wisdom is rare at any age, but they do have more tools to be wise, like experience and equanimity. So our brains are actually being rewired in ways that help us feel satisfied with life.
That is fascinating.
And this is crazy because the whole stereotype of aging is that we get cranky and
decline
miserable.
And cranky and that's it. Just,
The opposite-
stiff upper lip as best you can till you fall apart.
The opposite is true. If your friends are feeling pretty shabby about life in their mid-40s, and one of the reasons they're feeling shabby is, my God, I'm not satisfied now, and it's all downhill from here. This is the best it's ever going to be. Tell them they're wrong. What's happening to them is a natural transition that's happening in their brains and happening in their value sets that is equipping them for a second phase of life. It's going to be more organized around giving to others, around the relationships, the core relationships that they care most about, and that's going to continue probably until the day they die. The best is yet to come. And knowing that is so important when you're feeling gloomy.
I'm going to tuck that in my back pocket. That sounds great. And also I can now use this as advice to my friends, in addition to telling them just to buy your book. That is phenomenal news. This is a stupidly reductive question, but it illustrates.
I would expect no less of you, Andrew.
Thank you. Okay, that a midlife crisis is not, as you established, and you made a very compelling argument on this, grappling with a perpetual downward demise. It's not that you were staring at decline and coming to terms with it. Is it basically teething? Is it a transition like puberty or something that we're doing internally?
That's a good way to think about it. There's no exact analogy, but it's kind of like adolescence, a time of transition. Some people, the teenage years are great, but a lot of people have trouble in their teen years because it's a time of change and adjustment, and your life is changing. Of course, your body is changing, but your values are changing. You care about different things. And if you think about how we as a society deal with the teenage transition, we get a lot of help. Of course, there are parents who've been through it, but we also have schools.
Yeah.
You've
got a cohort that's going through it.
Sports teams. Yeah. We have the churches. We have all of these people in our lives who are helping guide us through it and saying, maybe checking in, how are you doing today? We have milestones to let us know that we're actually moving through life in a regular expected fashion. We have your bar mitzvah or your cotillion and your graduation, and then you have another graduation and so forth. In midlife, you're also going through a time of vulnerability and transition. Your values are changing. Your brain is changing. Your expectations are changing, but you're not getting any help. In fact, if you tell your friend Andrew Heaton that you're going through this, he might just be a total dick about it and say, oh, you must be having midlife crisis. When are you going to leave your wife and get a sports car? Hardy har har.
Honestly, until I read your book, I think what I would have done is I would have gone, hey, take stock of all the wonderful things in your life. And I would never have said you're being irrational about this. But that's basically what I would thinking is, this is some quirk you've got in your mind. Look at all the great things you got going.
Get over it.
You just need to take a step back and appreciate where you are. You're doing great. Your sadness is irrational. Therefore, snap your fingers and make it go away.
Yeah. It's that, or you're having midlife crisis. We have made a joke of midlife crisis.
No.
And we don't understand that midlife is a time of emotional vulnerability. And not only because so much is expected of us in midlife, but also because we're in the heart of this transition from one part of life, which is socially very ambitious, to late adulthood, which is the time of taking stock and moving to our central priorities. What's so important here is I tell people, if there's one message from my book that I would like to really get across, it's that midlife is not a DIY project. This is a project we need to be looking out for each other so that we have friends that we can go to. It's very important not to get isolated. We need to have institutions that recognize this is going on for people. For example, it ought to be possible to take 1 year of your Social Security in advance and use it to go back to school. We ought to have midlife gap years for people.
Oh my God, a midlife gap year. That's brilliant.
Who are thinking about, so your values are changing.
Yeah.
And what's happening for people is you don't want to run away to Honduras with an inappropriate person, but you do want to begin thinking about, okay, my values are changing. I'm reaching a different time in life. How do I approach this? Coaching is a great model for this. I came away convinced. A good life coach, not like a psychiatrist, isn't going to try to medicate you because you're not broken. In fact, you're well. That's the whole point. But a life coach is going to be experienced in saying, okay, what are your values now? What are you looking to do? How can we sort through what you're doing with your life to match your values? How do we make these things align? And the coach will approach you as an ally, which is neither a friend nor a doctor. And that's what we all need. But each of us can be a coach to some extent. And we need to rewire midlife in society so that there's a lot more support.
We won't go too far into policy. I love the idea of a midlife gap year where you can tap your Social Security like that. For one thing, there's a lot of people that work their whole life, and like I'm fortunate. I didn't start working full time in a proper adult job till I was about 23. You know, I did part-time work and stuff before that. There's a lot of people that work at 18 and work until they're 60 and drop dead and never get to enjoy any of that. So that I feel like is a nice kind of insurance policy that you do get to have a year where most people are still in good health that could actually enjoy and avail themselves to those opportunity. And then from leaning into the midlife stereotype, being able to explore those options and those changes in a healthy way rather than dropping the things that are working, like your marriage or your community or whatever. That's brilliant.
Oh, there's tons of good ideas around this. Some of them are being implemented, but it's crazy that we pack pretty much all of education into the first 20 years of life and then do nothing, despite the fact that so much is changing about ourselves. But there are now things like elder academies. There are programs now at universities that are specifically catering to people making career transitions. We have started to see a little bit in corporate America of making available what are sometimes called not so hard jobs. These are for the people in their workforce in their 50s and 60s who aren't necessarily interested in being CEO, but want to work with, for example, younger people, share their wisdom, work in teams. It turns out that mixed age teams are more productive because it's good for the young people to have those older people in the mix. So corporations can do more of that kind of thing. There are all kinds of ideas about changing society so that it better matches where we actually are and utilizes this transitional stage of life.
I would also think that would just be very helpful for one of the other things where we're having increasing conversations, I think for good, on maternity leave and paternity leave. And well, okay, if I'm a company and I'm legally required to provide maternity leave, maybe I'm just going to hire more men because I'm worried that we're going to bottom out that work. But if you had a kind of almost like high knowledge temp worker pool that you could draw on of people that are like, look, I'm going to do this for 6 months. I'm doing it because I want to try out a new field and it's fun, but I don't want to, I'm 52. I'm not looking to become a CEO of your company, but I'm going to come in and do that. Or I'm semi-retired at 60. Like I could see that kind of complementing them where it would take pressure off the one and allow for more expansive changes.
Exactly. And don't think people aren't ambitious in their 50s and 60s. Another fact that blew me away doing this research, according to the Kauffman Foundation, there are more startup entrepreneurs in their 50s than there are in their 20s.
Really? Really?
Yeah, and I talked to a
That
bunch
runs
of these
afoul
people
of
when
all
I
of
did my
the
book.
Silicon Valley-based sitcoms that I've watched.
Well, that's right. But what you have is you get a cohort of experienced people whose values are changing, and they're thinking, maybe how can I give back, or how can I do something that seems more rewarding? And they'll go off and start something. It might be a nonprofit. It might be a company. It might be a local project of some sort. A lot of people do that. And I talked to some of them, and they report that this can be incredibly rewarding. So there's all kinds of avenues here to take advantage of. But the beginning of all of that is to rewire our own thinking, both individually and socially, about the aging process. We've been throwing away late adulthood on the assumption that it's a period of decline, that older people are not as creative, they're not as flexible, they're grouchy, they're getting decrepit, they can't remember anything. All of these stereotypes are wrong. Instead of throwing away late adulthood, what we need to think a lot harder about is actually specifically you, because you're 20 plus years younger than I am, are getting the greatest gift in the entire history of the human species, or maybe number 2 after medical care. Life is getting longer. It's already 5 plus years longer than it was when I was born. And that's life expectancy in adulthood.
It's not even at the time of birth. Yeah.
That's not even at time of birth.
That's
If at time of birth, it's 10 plus years. And it's going up. So your generation is going to get an extra, 10 or more years of lifespan. Most of it's going to be healthy, and it's going to be in the most satisfying and pro-social time of life, which is late adulthood, which is when you're on that rising part of the U curve, and you've moved into that part of your life when you're giving back. I mean, think about that, all those extra years and the most satisfying part of life. The problem is, as a society, we're throwing that away by saying, well, at 65, you retire and you're never heard from again.
You golf for 3 years, then you die. Thank you for your service.
Exactly. We're built on a model from the 1930s and 1940s.
Yeah.
So we have this huge cohort of incredibly talented people ready to give back. And that's the opportunity that's available to us if we can seize it.
I think that's also the pitch to corporate America. I am moved by the human side of this and people reaching their full potential. But if I were on the board of directors for, Deloitte or Microsoft or something, I'd go, untapped labor pool, you say?
Yes.
We could more efficiently use our human resources? Go on. Yeah. I want to backtrack a little bit. You mentioned that brains are changing. So I want to be clear on this. I understand that as people get older, it is easier for us to contextualize bad things better than when we're younger. Like if you've got if you can imagine like a what do you call it? One of those charts where you have overlapping circles, Venn diagram of like, there's a bad thing. It's about the size of a quarter. If your whole life is only the size of a $50, that dominates your life. You break your leg at 10, that's a really big deal, but like you break your leg at 30, it sucks, but you can contextualize it more. But that's all me relying on nothing internal changing, but rather just an accumulation of data that allows me to react better. So I'm wiser, I guess. But it sounds like that's not what you're describing, that it's not just that we have more data, therefore we're able to contextualize things more, but that our brains themselves are actually changing.
Well, of course it's both, because we're humans, we can change our brains, and experience will do that. It will teach us things, and that will affect our attitudes. So that's certainly a factor. The point I was making was a little bit different, which is that these changes are changes, however they're coming about, whether it's strictly biological or whether it's as a result of gained experience, they are measurable. You can put people in an fMRI and watch what happens. It's called the positivity effect. People react as they age more to the sweet and less to the sour. And I discovered this in my research. I gave a questionnaire to a lot of people, and then I interviewed a whole bunch of them. And I'll never forget, one of my neighbors was a 93-year-old cancer patient. And she said that she was happier in the sense of life satisfaction with life then than she had ever been before and would not want to go back to her 20s or to be young again. And you could see it in her attitude. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people who are having a terrible time in their 70s. And I'm not saying there aren't people who are having a great time in their 40s. Again, your mileage will vary. But what I'm trying to do is break the stereotype of a downward trajectory in life.
With the neurological changes that are happening, you've used the word changes or alterations. You haven't said decline. So the standard interpretation is your mind is operating slower and your memory is chipping away and your mileage will vary, but basically your brain finishes developing at 25, then it plateaus, and then it's just you're just trying to manage entropy as best as possible. But it doesn't sound to me like that's what you're talking about. It sounds like it's a different change rather than just decline.
That's right. We have a terrible stereotype of aging. Ageism, age discrimination is the most prevalent form of discrimination in the world. By approximately fourth grade, children will already tell you it's terrible to be old. And the stereotypes are wrong. Yes, it is certainly true that short-term memory declines with age. And I can tell you that because I'm a writer and I rely on notes that I keep in my head. On the other hand, there's some evidence that as cognitive sharpness declines in certain specific areas of the brain is plastic, and other areas compensate. And there may be what some scholars call all-wheel drive, which is you're engaging more different parts of your brain in doing tasks as you age, and that may lead to more balance and better outcomes. And of course, it's also true that older people tend to react less to the vagaries of the moment. They have emotional storms, they get angry and they get sad and those kinds of things. Of course, we all do. But the storms don't last as long. They pass faster. I mentioned the positivity effect, which is reacting more to the sweet in life and less to the sour. And then there's my favorite thing to talk about, which is wisdom. And that, to me, in some ways, that was the most interesting thing I discovered writing this book.
So what is the difference? Well, hold on, I'll put a pin in that for a second too. One of the mini blurbs that you had for the book, you had a 3-page cavalcade of leading thinkers. One of them, I think, is Arthur Brooks, who just had a book come out on how intelligence is fluid when you're young and it becomes fractal when you're older. I've not read his book, but I listened to an interview. It scared the piss out of me, because he was basically making the case that your brain doesn't work as well when you're older, but don't worry, you can downshift into a teaching role and you'll find it equally fulfilling. And it scared me because I was like, well, so much of my identity is based around being clever and funny and things like that I was worried. Then I thought about it, and like the funniest book I've ever read is The Stench of Honolulu by Jack Handey. And I checked on this. He wrote it in his 60s. So it doesn't seem to be impeding humor at all. It sounds like raw memory is affected, but like creativity, problem solving abilities, I would think pattern recognition would be much better, a la the fractal thing.
Yeah. I am far from an expert on geriatric psychology. It's a different field than the stuff I've looked at. I'm a journalist anyway, so I couldn't tell you what does and doesn't change on average in specific ways. What I can tell you is that there are a lot of compensations for aging, and some of them are emotional. So some of those storms and turbulence that your friends are feeling right now will go away.
Okay.
And some of what seems like a big friggin' deal when you're 35 or 40 will be something that you can roll with and put in better perspective. And a lot of the things you're doing may be more rewarding, more in keeping with your values. And all of that stuff matters. It's not just about whether you can mentally rotate an object in a certain amount of time. When you think about it, that may not be the single most important thing in life.
Well, I'm more and more I think my teething analogy is a bad one. I think puberty is a really good one. Because like if I were talking to a 16-year-old and they were like, I feel weird. I'm having mood swings. I have hair in odd places.
Of course. I know what you do. You'd say, oh, you're going through teenage crisis. Where are all your zits?
Yeah. And
you got your acne
and
yet?
by the way, you can think your way out of this. This is a problem with you. And if you think correctly, this puberty will stop. You'd be like, no, listen, this is going to happen regardless. And the best you can do is just be aware of it and accommodate
think about how lucky you are.
Yeah. You could be in China. You know, kids would love to have puberty in China.
Exactly.
So it's something that's going to, this is it's some degree of reacting to external stimuli, but it's also some degree of internal inbuilt human changes that are going to happen. And so you're not going to think your way out of it. You just kind of have to like ride the boat.
Well, and here's the thing. I alluded to this earlier, but so what's the point of this transition? Of course, we can't say for sure. There's no way to do an experiment for that. But human beings are one of only 3 or 4 species on the planet. The others include, I think, orcas and some other underwater creatures, in which the females of the species outlive their reproductive years. So think about this for a minute. From a purely evolutionary point of view, if Heaton can't reproduce, he is a dead body walking around.
Yeah, I'm just a mouth to feed that could be going to babies.
Exactly. Yeah. There is no reason to keep shoveling food into this object. It should just go away.
Mm-hmm.
And most creatures do. Humans don't. In fact, we outlive our reproductive years for women. Men, of course, can keep at it for quite some time. But women outlive their reproductive years by, sometimes 40 or 50 years. Well, why would that happen? When we look at other species that have the same phenomenon, it looks like what's going on is that keeping the elders around helps with tasks like childcare. It helps the offspring of the elders, and even more than that, it helps the offspring of the offspring. That's the grandchildren. So it's good for the whole social group. And moreover, it seems like maybe these elders actually know something about life and can transmit it.
And if they are having less reactive responses to negative stimulus, they're less affected by slights. One would think that they would also be better mediators, that they would probably be better at conflict resolution than a 30-year-old who's looking to claim as much status as he possibly can.
And think of the times in your life. I can think of so many in mine when people in their 50s, 60s, and beyond just were there with that piece of advice.
Yeah.
So judging from what's happening in other species, this is called the grandmother hypothesis. It's a conjecture, but it suggests that there is a reason for this transition we're going through, and that going through it, we wouldn't want to get rid of midlife slump, even if we could, because it's leading us to this good result. And it's good for the people around us. It's just something we have to go through.
And that is so fascinating, because the implication is that it's not that the midlife slump is just decline and response to decline, but it is a pro-social evolutionary adaptation.
Exactly.
Where you're shifting from resource accumulation and breeding to group positivity.
Exactly. And of course, again, you can't prove it, you would expect, if our role is changing in that evolutionary way, you would expect our psychology and our brains to change with it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. People just need more help getting through it than they're getting.
Can I toss a couple of theories I've got at you that would comport with this? My father has a lot of difficulty sleeping. He's in his 70s. And I know a lot of people that are in their 70s that have difficulty thinking, not thinking, sleeping. And I theorize, if we're hunter-gatherers and you're 70, you're probably not going to be really good at downing an elk with a spear, but we do need somebody to stay up and keep watch. So it kind of, I think it might actually be an inbuilt feature where people just sleep worse as they get older because they're playing sentry in a...
I don't know. It could be.
Like, I don't think I've gone through a night without paying at least once in the last 5 years. So like, that's now something that I have to... I'm like, maybe my body's wiring me to wake up and check for tigers or something, since the 25-year-olds that are downing all the elks need to be getting their sleep. So that's fascinating, and also makes me feel so much better about whatever's ahead. I cut you off on wisdom. What's the difference between, like, say, wisdom and intelligence?
This is my favorite chapter in the book, and the one I least get to talk about. When I was around 25, I developed a slogan, which is, I don't want to be a hot shot. I don't want to be a big shot. I want to be a deep shot. And that's because I realized that the people in my life who had been most helpful to me had this elusive quality that we call wisdom. I didn't really necessarily have that word for it. And that I wanted to have that. So fast forward to today, right now, and think about the compliments that you give someone. You would say, that Andrew Heaton, man, that guy is so smart. When was the last time you heard somebody say something like, that Andrew Heaton, he's wise? It's not even really part of the vocabulary. And
it's almost like a consolation we give to old people. I don't ever hear that for anybody under 60.
So here was another big surprise in a research project that was full of surprises. Wisdom is a thing. It's not just folklore, myth, or superstition. It is scientifically definable. You can measure it, you can test it, you can improve it with practice. It has a number of traits, but they include things like equanimity, perspective. A key of wisdom is being able to lift yourself above a situation and see it as others see it, not just from your own point of view. And maybe the most important thing about wisdom is it's characterized by being good at guiding through complicated social situations. That's what wise people tend to be especially good at, saying, wait a minute, Heaton, maybe you're misinterpreting the situation at the office. Maybe they mean this, or maybe this other approach would work better. So wisdom is an actual thing. It does not map onto intelligence. A lot of very intelligent people are not wise. For example, Newt Gingrich comes to mind. I'm sure you can name others.
Mm-hmm.
It does not directly map on experience, though experience helps. It doesn't map onto knowledge. It's its own thing. And it turns out that wisdom is contagious, because not only is it good for you to be wise, it's good for all the people around you if you're wise. It makes them wiser, which is probably why it tends to be selected for. So we don't automatically get wise with age. Wisdom, as I said earlier, it's rare and precious at any age. But all of the things we've been talking about better equip you for wisdom, being more pro-social, being more interested in helping others, having these kinds of experiences in life, thinking in a more pro-social way instead of less just about what have I accomplished today. So this is part of the great good news of aging. And if you ask me, would I give up some ability to rotate an abstract object in my head or add a column of numbers in order to be wiser? Man, I think I'm going to go for the wisdom. Now you, on the other hand, I don't know about.
I don't know, because I think, as you note, wisdom is folklore slash, I think, old people characteristic. If it's not as a proxy for aging, have you ever by chance played Dungeons and Dragons?
No.
You roll characters at the beginning where you determine what the attributes are, and you'll have like a 7 for strength, a 4 for intelligence, a 5 for wisdom, or something like that. They're distinct within that world, and it might very well generally, like, wisdom might be more good for something. So I don't know. I like the trade-off you're saying. You did say that it is a measurable thing. What are we measuring? Is it neural connections between unlike things? Is it social circuits specifically?
No, there are tests for wisdom. The New York Times website has a short one, though there are longer ones that are more specific. But it's a whole battery of questions asking people how they react in specific kinds of situations, what they value, and so forth. And it gives you actually a pretty good rating if you answer it honestly, which of course you have to do. But it'll rate your wisdom in different specific categories.
There's like a WQ, like a wisdom quotient, as opposed to an EQ and IQ.
Yeah. And there's a couple now different established scientific tests for wisdom, and they're pretty good. They pretty much map onto what you and I would observe in an actual person. So I want to put Wallace on the tape. Wait, let's have
we could totally
Wallace,
do that.
Come on over here.
Right. Hey, Wallace, come here. Right. John, try howling like you're a coyote. Just watch this. See if he does it. very frustrated. He has a very good internal clock. So we'll finish up here in a moment, John. Before we started, you mentioned that there is new research that if it doesn't upend your book, which I hope not, given the wonderful conversation we've had about it, it at least adds a wrinkle to it. What exactly has come about the last couple of years?
So everything that I've said about midlife and late life remains true. But this just in from the World Happiness Report, which was released just a few weeks ago, and now from additional research that is assessing the numbers in a couple of dozen countries, including the United States and Canada and most of the Anglosphere, something new is going on that we don't fully understand. But that beginning part of life, those first 10 or 15 years that are supposed to be the high part of the curve where you're going down, young people are not happy. Suddenly, an age gap has opened up that we haven't ever seen before between older people and younger people. Now, remember, the curve is supposed to be U-shaped, right? So
it's supposed to be pretty high in your 20s on average.
Pretty high in your 20s, and then dropping in your 40s, and then rising and then exceeding later in life. And of course, if you wanted to change that, ideally, you do it by lifting the middle. Unfortunately, it seems to be changing by depressing the first third of the curve.
And to be clear, this is not that we're better at diagnosing it, where children and young people were always depressed. We just didn't realize it. This is something different.
No, this is a new phenomenon.
Okay.
Yes. These surveys have been asked for years, and this is, you can see all of this in World Happiness Report. I think it's .org or .com. They brought this out as the big takeaway. People are concerned about it because unhappy young people, what does that mean the future looks like? So smart people are looking at this, scratching their heads. What does this mean? Where is it going? What does it augur? How much does it have to do with things that'll pass? For example, we know that it's harder to rent a house or an apartment if you're younger. We know we've had issues with failure to launch, and there's all of this concern about screens and young people.
That's my guess is social media and screens. And
Jonathan Haidt has a new book about that. So there's a lot of work to be done to understand what's happening in the beginning of life. And I mention this not because we yet know what's going on, but just to flag that the winds may have changed in interesting and maybe not so good ways.
Well, I'm very glad you did, because I hope and think that this will be both a useful and very uplifting episode for people that are finding themselves in the midlife transition. In the same way that we don't want to belittle people that are going through that as, somehow silly or selfish or whatever. If there are a bunch of 18-year-olds listening to the program, they're like, I'm really struggling and I'm depressed, and they're saying that this should be the height and then it gets worse. Like, it's good to know that may be applied to you and me in terms of our life rhythms, but that's not the same life rhythm that necessarily somebody in their teens, 20s are going to be experiencing now.
Yes, we'll see. Watch this channel.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Well, then I'll do one final question for you. Just any last piece of advice for anybody that is either going through a midlife transition or is about to go through it?
Well, what I'm about to say is so predictable and self-serving that you will either laugh at me or throw me out of the room, which is the best thing to do, I think, is to read my book.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is not only is the science there's also a chapter of specific things that people can do if they're feeling they're in one of these midlife malaise traps. And they're not generic things like take your vitamins, exercise regularly, and eat right. They're things that are specific to this kind of situation. So check it out. Check out the book.
I will, in fact, second that advice. I know this audience very well, and there are a lot of very smart, extremely bookish, data-driven people that listen to this program, and I can tell you guys would very much like this book. There is a abundance of fascinating economic and scientific data that we didn't go into because I really wanted to nail down the thesis of this, but there's There's so much more to this. And for anybody that, for me, all my brain circuits lit up when you started bringing up like orangutans and things, because then I could go, oh, great, now we've got a statistical comparison we can use to flush out a thesis. There are lots of things like that in the book. So while I think that this has a self-help component to it, it feels very, very, very different to me than like Tony Robinson or something, or that is just bumping you up through sheer fluff. There is a platonic core of data here with a lot of very eloquent explanation and advice. So
every so often, Andrew, I get an email out of the blue from someone who says, I am so glad I know about this. I really thought something was wrong with me. And now I know that there's not. And that's so gratifying.
Wonderful. Well, I'm delighted to have you back on the show again. It's fun to hang out with you. And also very pleased that you suggested this and I was able to read this. I'm feeling pretty good right now, but I don't know what my mileage is going to look like. So if my log ride does start to dip here in a couple years, I'm very glad that I know what's going on. So thank you for all your work. Thank you for coming on the show, John.
Thank you.
And everybody else, remember that book is The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After Age 50. You can find that Amazon bookstores, but I will point you to mightyheaton.com/featured, where I put all of the books discussed on this program. The Political Orphanage is a listener-funded enterprise, and I think, this is just my opinion, I think it's worth it. If you do too. If you want to see this plucky little podcast continue chugging up a hill, picking up fun misfits and deep thinkers and hitchhikers and old train-riding tramps that hop aboard this analogy, then please consider supporting the show. Go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Each week, patrons get to enjoy a bonus episode on top of the regular show, and this week, we are going to keep this conversation going, but go in a little bit different direction when Brian Brushwood joins to discuss the following situation. Several fields, like mathematics or acting, have the idea that if you haven't made it by 30, if you haven't popped in that field by 30, you're done. Give up. You're just not creative or smart enough, and bad news, your mind's only going to decline from here. Well, Brian and I have encountered a very interesting counter theory that sure made me feel a lot better. And for any creative people, or I suppose mathematicians, who didn't go stratospheric in your 20s, I think it's pretty good news for you too. That's this week's very germane, data-driven but thoroughly optimistic bonus episode, which is a good side dish to what you just heard. And patrons, you get that as thanks for your support. You can join them by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. That's the show. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Jonathan Rauch, for coming on to discuss the true nature of midlife transitions. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. And thank you, patrons who made it all possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.